Hello everyone! In this video we're going to be talking about some background for the Native American origin stories that you're going to read. So in a study of American literature, why should we start American literature with Native American stories? Why are we starting here and not with Pilgrims or not with Columbus or not with a novel? Why are we starting with Native American origin stories? To back up a little bit, all literature is about stories. You've spent most of the first few days of school this year thinking about what stories are, why they matter, how they show up in your own life, because all literature is about stories. That seems obvious, but we're going to expand this definition a little bit. Literature is about the stories that we tell ourselves, individually, as a culture, as a species. Literature is also about what stories we choose to tell about each other. Why do we tell the stories that we do? This goes for fiction as well as nonfiction. Why do we choose to form the narratives that we do about ourselves and about one another? Also, literature is about what stories we tell about the world around us. How do we talk about the solar system? How do we talk about the way the world began? How do we talk about things like climate change? And why do we tell these stories? Why do we tell the stories that we tell instead of different ones? So literature is about much more than just, I want to tell a nice, entertaining story. It's often about that, but even in a story that's just meant to entertain, we can learn a lot about the values and the priorities of the person telling the story, as well as about the culture that they came out of and the way that they see the world around them. Literature is also the study of looking at whose stories don't get told and trying to make sure that we hear those stories as well. So when we're thinking about the stories that we choose to tell, think about the voices that we leave out. So the reason why we're starting here, specifically, practically, is that Native Americans are the original Americans and their stories are the original American literature. By choosing to put these stories at the beginning of our curriculum, we're making a conscious decision to say that American literature doesn't start with the Pilgrims, that American literature doesn't begin with Columbus, that it begins in a much older place than that. We're prioritizing the voices of people who were already here when people started coming to America from Europe. So a little bit of background on our first set of authors. The history of Native folks, of indigenous folks in America is very long, and the most commonly accepted model of migration now is the Bering Land Strait model, where many thousands of years ago, the first people crossed what is now the Bering Strait and came down through what is now Canada and into the central United States, kind of in what is now Oklahoma, Nebraska, that part of the country. Because it used to be that you could cross from Asia to the Americas via what is now Alaska, that there used to be a lot more land there than there is today because water levels are higher than they were. So this is what we call the Paleo-Indian stage, or the Lithic stage. Now, Lithic means stone, so we're kind of talking about like Stone Age kind of stuff. So this Lithic stage lasted until about 3000 BC. Now, in other parts of the world, in 3000 BC, we're getting things like the Epic of Gilgamesh in Sumeria. We're getting sort of the oldest love poems coming out of Egypt. So around the world, a lot of different cultures are really starting to invent their own literatures. And the same thing is happening in the Americas. The only difference, and we'll see this in a moment, is that the Sumerians had chosen to write their stories down. They had developed cuneiform. In Egypt, they had sort of learned from their Middle Eastern neighbors, and they were starting to develop their own form of pictographs, of hieratic, of hieroglyphs. And so they were writing their stories down in a way that we don't have the same kinds of records of from the Americas. Not yet, anyway, but we will soon. So over time, the lithic peoples spread out across the continent and created a variety of different cultures. So obviously, depending on the geography and climate of where these people settled, really informed the way that they lived. So we often today think of Native Americans as kind of all living in little villages, whether we think of them as living in longhouses or like plains tribes living in like teepees, or um, tribes from the Pacific Northwest living in kind of log houses, but that's not always true. Several Native American tribes built huge cities and really big complex societies. Think less about longhouses and more about like Incan or Mayan civilizations where they had these really big cities. So in this picture on the right, you see the city of Cahokia, which is now kind of in the kind of Nebraska, Illinois, kind of Midwest kind of area. And at its height, it had about 20,000 people living there. And as you can see in this picture, there's sort of this downtown area with like a stadium and a big kind of administrative or temple building. There's kind of outlying houses and neighborhoods. So this is a very advanced city. On the right here, we see the city of Acoma Pueblo, which is in the southwest. And Acoma Pueblo has been, people have been living there consistently for 2,000 years. People have been living in the city for the entirety of what we would think of as the AD years. So this is really meaningful because very few places in the Americas have a history of consistent development and consistent living. You have to think about like European cities or cities in Asia, or to really get that sense of that length of history. In America, we think that, you know, like 100 years is a long time, right? Because our country is so new. The nation of the US is so new compared to a civilization like, you know, Japan or Italy even. But Acoma Pueblo has that length of history behind it. So again, to reiterate, the US is a huge landmass. We have deserts in the US, we have forests, we have mountains, we have valleys, plains, rainforests. We have all kinds of different ecosystems, all kinds of different ways of living. And really, these geographical and climate differences go a long way in informing the cultures of these indigenous tribes. So because many of these tribes were so spread out, because this is before the age of you know, cell phones and emails and ways to really communicate across long distances, every culture developed more independently. And so every culture had its own stories that they told about themselves and about the world around them. But they do share some very broad similarities. Very often, indigenous origin stories will be very piecemeal. Some cultures think about sort of Greek creation stories or Christian creation stories. They have one creation narrative, kind of in one fell swoop, everything was created. Oftentimes in indigenous American stories, what we see is a more piecemeal sort of creation, where we'll have a story about how this one thing was created. This is the story about how, you know, where bears came from. This is the story of why we have this mountain range. So that's one primary difference between indigenous American stories and other creation accounts. The other kind of key difference is that these were primarily oral narratives. Some indigenous tribes did have ways of writing down their stories. We see this in the complicated weavings of some southwestern tribes. We see this in kind of wall and rock and cave art. So some tribes were communicating stories visually and verbally, visually as well as verbally, but very few of them had a writing system that would really solidify stories in the way that we think about them. And so until very recently, most of these stories were oral narratives. So they were spoken, they were told. And I want you to think about the way that you tell stories to your friends. Every time you tell the same story, do you use the exact same words every time? I don't think so. Every time that you tell a story verbally or orally, the story changes just a little bit, even if only in the tiniest details or the exact words that you use. So what happens is, because these stories were only written down very recently, we actually have several different written accounts of the exact same story, where the details will change very minorly. So whenever you encounter an Indigenous American story, what you get is maybe a slightly different version than what you read last time, and that's okay. Because one of the things that this tells us about these cultures is that they very much prioritized the themes and the concepts and the big ideas rather than the very specific details. Oftentimes what you'll get in, for example, medieval European literature, you'll actually get warnings at the beginning of the story that say, if you copy down this story in writing, you will be cursed unless you get the exact language exactly the same, down to the tiniest word. I am the original author, and if you change anything that I wrote, then, God will smite you. You actually get this in medieval literature. It's amazing. But these oral narratives don't have that, because that's not what was important. So as you read these stories, you're going to read 3 of them. You're going to read a story by the Onondaga, and they're a tribe who originally lived in central New York. They were a member of the Iroquois Confederation, which is actually one of the earliest kind of democratic forms of government, and we're going to look more at that later in the semester. They lived in small villages where they would kind of build these big longhouses, and then kind of your extended family would live with you in them. And today the Onondaga have a reservation in New York. The second story we'll read is from the Navajo. The Navajo are the largest native nation in the U.S. currently, with about 100,000 members. So they have a really long history in the U.S. They have a really complicated history. Throughout their own history, they tended to intermarry with the Pueblo people. And today they have kind of a very strong population and a very strong continuing culture. The third story that you're going to read is from the Modoc. The Modoc lived in Oregon and Northern California in kind of independent villages that would sometimes come together in times of famine or war to support each other. They had a very complicated history in the 1800s, kind of this history of being moved around a lot, history of really being mistreated. They used to have a reservation, but that reservation was dissolved in the 1950s. So there are still people who are of Modoc heritage, but unlike the Onondaga and Navajo, unfortunately, they have no real home to call their own anymore. So those are the 3 stories that we're going to start reading. And as you read, I want you to think about the following things. I want you to think about how the land around them, the geography, the climate, how the land around each tribe would have informed the kind of stories that they told. Do they talk about deserts, mountains, certain animals that only live in certain climates, etc.? I want you to think about how these stories demonstrate each tribe's priorities, their cultural, religious, practical priorities, what they tend to think is important and worth lingering on. And third, I want you to think about their attitudes towards various animals, plants, and other natural elements. And then, it's not on the slide, but as I mentioned before, I also want you to think about these stories as being oral narratives. And with that in mind, what details seem like the really key elements that would always stay the same every time the story was told? And what seems like maybe it could be changed a little bit with each retelling? So after you watch this video, please do go ahead, read the stories, fill out the comprehension questions, make sure you do the vocabulary assignment, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.